morning. Thanks for braving the cold and the snow to come and worship the Lord today. If you take your Bibles and open up to Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 16. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 7 through 16. We are continuing through the book of Hebrews, looking at what the writer of Hebrews is communicating, first of all, to the first century audience that is tempted to defect back to the Jewish faith and abandon Christ. He spent about 10 chapters explaining the superiority of Christ and how defecting and going back to the law, going back to the ceremonies, going back to Moses, going back to Abraham would be silly when Christ is far superior to any of that. And then now he's expressing that the future life that God has for us is far superior to anything that the Jewish faith could promote to us or encourage us to follow. And that what God has for us is just way beyond anything we could ever imagine. So we need to live by faith because we don't yet enjoy it. This service has been interesting. First of all, to see so many of you come out and come here on a cold day. How many of you walked here today? Walked, okay. The first service actually had 12 people that walked. Some of them started in the dark to get here by the time that it was actually light, and it was 4 below at that time. 4 below, 0. I know. I just, it's so cool. And then watching the video that my wife put together for the special music, just, have you ever had glimpses outside of where you are? Where you feels like your hand is on the pulse of God himself? I had a couple of those during this service. Watching the video and realizing God and his grace and his mercy in light of what we're doing as a nation. And then watching the prayer time and watching my wife pray for someone and a little child putting their hand on the back of my wife, praying for Buddy and Chris. And then hearing my wife sing with all of her heart right behind me. There are times where I just feel so close to God. Like, God, do whatever you want to with me. It doesn't matter. Because if this is life with you, then it doesn't matter what I have to sacrifice to have it. And then there are other times that I'm going, God, are you there? Moses and Abraham had those times. I'm sorry, Noah and Abraham. Sorry, it was last week's. No, next week. I'm reading ahead and forgot where I was. And so Noah and Abraham come across as great men of faith, and they are great men of faith. And the writer of Hebrews is trying to get us to realize what they had in order for us to be able to live by the same kind of faith. And it's crucially important we live by faith because he told us last week in 11:6, without faith, it's impossible to please God. It's not just hard to please God, it's impossible to please God. Noah built an ark in the middle of land. It had never rained up to that point. So the water circumstances really aren't likely to change a whole lot. And yet here he's built. It'd be like building the ark in our church parking lot. In fact, after the first service, trying to describe how big this ark is. And by the way, there's a life-size replica of the ark that's in northern Kentucky, just south of Cincinnati, as you cross the river, next to the Creation Museum, where they have a life-size ark. My wife and I hope to be able to go there this summer because I want to be able to feel it. Just experience how big it is. But to give you an idea, its width was about the width of the church on this Union Street side. Okay? So the width of offices, sanctuary, and this area back here. The length would be from the sidewalk here on Union Street all the way to the little nook of parking beyond the vans. That's the length. And the height would be just about this height. 1.5 football fields long. It's huge. This is not something like Gibbs builds in his basement. And he can hide and nobody knows he's building a boat down there. This is obvious for the world. For 120 years, Noah built the ark. Can you imagine the songs that were created to make fun of him? Can you imagine the jokes that were made about Noah? 120 years. What are you doing this for? You're an idiot. All this time and resources. Think of the house you could have built. And here you are building this ark. And then Abraham the same way. He's 75 years old when he leaves home to a place he's not sure of. But he feels God has called him out of the Ur of Chaldees to go and pursue a land that God has promised him, but not to him, but to his great 400 years later descendants. He leaves his home to live in tents for the rest of his life. His children to live in tents. His grandchildren to live in tents. For 400 years they're in Egypt in captivity. And then finally, after 430 years, they finally get to inherit the promise that had been given to them. Then he goes around and tells everybody, well, God's promised me children. Abraham, you're 99. And your wife is 90. You're a lunatic. From every indication from the world's viewpoint, Noah and Abraham were idiots. But because they hung on to the promises of God and they followed through and lived their lives as if they were true and if they were really coming, which they did, God was pleased with them and was not ashamed to be called their God. Because that's exactly what he wants all of us to live our lives like. We really believe in the promises of God. Folks, and if we did, our lives would be revolutionarily changed. Revolutionarily? Sure, why not? They'd be changed because we would live with hope and with courage and with strength and with freedom. Listen very, very carefully as Christian Celestia comes and reads from Hebrews 11, 7 through 16.
Please stand if you're able. Hebrews 11, 7 through 16. By faith, Noah, when warned about the things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father, because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. You may be seated.
I just love this text. Actually, this week and 2 weeks from now when I have a chance to preach again, Pastor Dave is going to be preaching next week. I just love these passages that talk about what real faith is involved with and what real faith is. Because, folks, I don't know about you all, but on a pretty regular basis, I see the disappointment of this world. just... And there's this constant nagging in the back of my mind, in the depths of my soul. This isn't right. There's something missing about this world. And folks, there is. There is. This world is not our home. We're just passing through. And so if you would follow along the sermon outline, I encourage you to do that, because there are several quotes I want you to track along with. A couple of them, especially by C.S. Lewis, that I think would be very, very important for us to digest today. Here's the question to be answered. What can we learn from Noah and Abraham about living by faith? I believe the answer is this. If you live by faith in God, you are going to look like an idiot in the eyes of the world. Just buck up and face it. They have a different value system. They don't believe in the promises of God. They don't believe in a life beyond this world. And so they're going to see your sacrifice in this world. They're going to see the things that you give up in this world in order to invest in the next world as being foolhardy and silly. You are an alien and a stranger in this world because you are a citizen of heaven. The Apostle Paul tells us that in chapter 3 of Philippians. Your full meal deal reward is in heaven, not here on earth. The full meal deal, if you remember, when my family used to go to Dairy Queen, this is back in the 80s, we would buy their full meal deal, which meant a hamburger, French fries, drink, and a dessert, a sundae. But they didn't give you the sundae right away, because by the time you finish your hamburger and your French fries and your drink, the dessert would be a pool, melted. That's the word I'm looking for. And so they give you a token that when you finish your meal, you could take the token back up to the counter and you got your sundae fresh right off of the... And that's why you went to Dairy Queen, right? Otherwise, you go to McDonald's or you go to Burger King. A lot of you look at me like, this is strange. You're talking about fast food. Here it is, 20 to 12, and you're being an idiot, Pastor Keith, because you're just tempting people to think about food rather than the message. Well, it's part of my plan to get you to long for the full meal deal. Because we always set the tokens right in front of us, because this was nice, the burger and the fries and the drink was nice, but some of you must not like ice cream. Folks, what we're doing here on earth is eating the burger and the fries and the drink. But the full meal deal is when we hand in our token to God and say, aren't you glad, when God says, aren't you glad that Jesus gave you this token? Through his shed blood and broken body, he has allowed you to enter into heaven. And by faith, you've kept the token. By faith, you realize that there was a full meal deal in heaven for you. There is a city rather than living in tents like we do now. That's part of the contrast that the apostle here that's writing, the writer of Hebrews is getting us to realize that this is just temporary. We're all tents living in tents. The Apostle Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians the same way, about our body being tents. I want to show you a picture of the ark. There are actually people, I don't know if you can see little white dots about 75% toward the left end. Those little white dots are people, adults. It's huge. This is my grandchildren, wonderful kids, much better than yours. But, sorry, this may or may not be true. Noah built this with, maybe he used contractors, who knows how he built it. The scripture text doesn't tell us all the details. But folks, the very fact of building it for 120 years took a lot of faith. Word for the day, again, is faith, and it's going to be for several more Sundays. Word for the day is faith. How can we learn from Noah and Abraham what can we learn from Noah and Abraham about living by faith? 1, to the world, you're an idiot. You just need to realize that the world's going to make fun of you, the world's going to persecute you, but blessed are you when men make fun of you and persecute you because of Jesus, because of your faith. Jesus himself gives us that blessing in the Beatitudes. I love this quote by Alistair Begg. The characteristics of Christian discipleship are, from the world's perspective, all the marks of losers. The world is going to look at our lives and say, you're a loser. Why are you valuing these things? You could do so much if you just learn to take advantage of the situations that you're in rather than being so compassionate and gracious. And what's this love business? That doesn't do you any good at all. You seem to be only concerned about other people. Why aren't you concerned about yourself? I remember really strange. The Better Business Bureau recommended a book. This is back in like 1977 or something like that. Gave me a book, well, didn't give me a book, but recommended me to go and buy a book that talked about how you could hold bank officers hostage and how you could take advantage of suppliers and how you could work the shipping industry and all for your advantage by just taking advantage of people and exploiting them in their weaknesses. Folks, you can live that way, but you're going to live without God's blessing. And you're obviously not living by faith because you're trusting in your own manipulation, you're trusting in your own schemes, in your own doings to make it. And besides, that world isn't a world worth living in. I don't know about you all, but I want to live in a world in which people are gracious and patient and compassionate and kind and loving and good. Not to have to watch out all the time about the next person who wants to steal my lunch and take advantage of me. But what kind of world do we live in? The wisdom of this world is foolishness in God's sight. If you take your marching orders from this world, you're not Christ. You're not a member of Christ. In fact, you adulterous people, James tells us, don't you know that friendship with the world is hatred towards God? Anyone who chooses to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God, James 4:4. And if you're living and working in an asylum and the residents start making sense, it's time to get out of there. So if this world doesn't make sense, you're healthy. If this world frustrates you, that means your spirit is still intact. If this world makes you long for a better place and a better world, praise God. Your spirit is still sensitive and alive. Woe unto you if you become comfortable in this world and become accepting of the world's values. There was one time about 18 years ago when Tony Campolo, I don't know if you've ever heard him, he's a Christian speaker that loves to challenge the status quo. Never forget when he came to my college, Huntington College in Huntington, Indiana, and swore from the pulpit. Just blatantly swore. The administration, I thought, was going to have a coronary. It was absolutely delightful to watch. Sorry, this is 1973. But Tony Campolo always challenges the system. And at Spring Arbor University, the president that year had gotten up before Tony Campolo and praised all the teachers and the student body because their students had went out into the law field, their students had went into medicine, their students had went into teaching, and they were all doing great things in the field of medicine and law and education. This is what Tony Campolo said, according to the CITPAT, the Citizen Patriot newspaper, in an article about Tony Campolo. This is what Tony Campolo said after the president got up praising the students and their graduates. If this was really a Christian school, nobody would want your graduates. Imagine a Christian joining the American Bar Association and challenging frivolous lawsuits that should never have gone to court in the first place. Or imagine asking physicians why they do unnecessary surgeries or cheat Medicare. Or teachers supporting having teachers being tested so the incompetent teachers are no longer in the classroom. If you're going to be Christian, you must be extremely countercultural, Tony Campbell said. But today's Christian doesn't like to make trouble. Read the book of Acts and see what early Christians said and stood for. They turned their world upside down. Folks, Christians should make people uncomfortable if they're not living righteous lives. And they're going to hate you for it. I like this quote from Socrates. It's actually in your sermon outline, a quote that's buried in John MacArthur's quote. Black never seems so black as when white is put beside it. The man of faith rebukes the world just by his living, even if he never utters a word of reproach. A young man of Athens told Socrates, I hate you because every time I meet you, you show me what I am. I don't know about you all. I know that to be true about my own life. When I'm around really, really respectable people, righteous people, holy people, they make me feel about this big. Good. You need it, Pastor Keith, so that you never forget your need for Jesus. So that you never forget, it's not your righteousness that allows you to enjoy what God has. It's what Jesus has done for us. Trust in that, even if people hate you, even if people think you're an idiot. By faith, you'll hang on no matter what. Number 2, this world is not your home. What can we learn from Noah and Abraham about living by faith? They didn't live as this world was their residence. By Noah's faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. That's in verse 7b. Verses 13b through 16a. All these people admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. Verse 14 of today's text. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Folks, I can tell you in all earnestness, the older I get, the more I'm looking for the world to come and letting go of this world. When I was 19 and first beginning my store in Huntington, Indiana, I was hanging onto this world tooth and nail because I thought my future was here. I thought my future was in business and was selling guitars and being able to run a business and doing good service for people and all these kind of things that starry-eyed college students have when they're young and haven't seen enough of the world to realize this world will never bring satisfaction. This world will never be everything you expect it to be. That's, I believe, one of the reasons why God continues to allow us to be frustrated here, to force us to look towards that next world, to force us to realize there is a better world. I love this letter, 2nd century letter, Diogenes, describing the Christian's lifestyle in the following way. This is in your sermon outline. They live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They have a share in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign land is their fatherland, and yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. It is true that they are in the flesh, but they never live according to the flesh. They busy themselves on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws, but in their own lives they go far beyond what the law requires. They love all people, and by all people are persecuted. They are unknown, and still they are condemned. They are put to death, and yet they are brought to life. They are poor, and yet they make many rich. They are completely destitute, and yet enjoy complete abundance. They are dishonored, and in the very dishonor are glorified, and they are defamed and are vindicated. They are reviled, and yet they bless. And when they are affronted, they still pay due respect. Christians dwell in the world, but are not of the world. And going on, the Christian way, C.S. Lewis from Mere Christianity. The Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger where there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim where there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for something of which they are only a kind of copy or echo or mirage. Listen to this. I must keep alive in myself the desire for my true country, which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. I believe that's what the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25. Every longing that you have, every frustration that you have, every frustration and longing that you see creation having, every hurricane, every tornado, every tsunami, every earthquake, is earth waiting to be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God, the Apostle Paul says. All of earth is wanting to be liberated. How much more we who have the Spirit of truth in us, wanting to be freedom from our bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. Read Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25. The Apostle Paul says, every frustration, every agony, every suffering, every heartache that you have in this world should be red flags reminding you this world is not your home. You were made for another world. This world could have been okay, but we screwed it up and destroyed it. Way back in Genesis chapter 3. And it's not been suitable ever since. A missionary was coming from Africa after 30 years of service. In fact, it was barely possible for him to get home. The mission board that had sent him to Africa had to work for a year just to get the money raised in order to get him on a liner to ship him back by sea back to New York and finally back home again after 30 years of service. And he was coming home, and as he was coming up to the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor, he was thinking, nobody's going to be there. I bet my mission board isn't even there to come and see me come home. And he saw on the dock, a sign said, welcome home. And he thought, whoa, they remembered. Somebody's actually here to greet me. And then as he got closer, he saw, welcome home, President Roosevelt. And he prayed, God, here I am coming home and nobody even cares. Why doesn't somebody love me? And in a still small voice, God said, it's because you're not home yet. We expect this world to give us all of what we're looking for. It's incapable. You're going to live in frustration. You're going to live with unmet expectations. That's part of living in this world. In this world, you will have trouble, Jesus said. But allow those to force you to look forward and hang on by faith to that next world that God has for you. There's a song that, there's a quartet in the church in Indiana that we attended that this quartet sang about once a year. This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. Number 3, what can we learn from Noah and Abraham about living by faith? We live on earth sure of what we hope for and certain of the reward we do not yet see for those who earnestly seek God. Verse 16 from today's text from Hebrews 11. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Verse 1 of this whole chapter 11. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. if you really lived with the certainty and the confidence that you are going to live in an absolutely wonderful world, you would live with grace and with hope and with courage and strength here. Because you'd be knowing where you're going, and anything this world could throw at you would just roll off your back like water off a duck. Because your hope would be somewhere else. Your eyes would be focused somewhere else. Jesus is not against investment, John Piper says. It's in your sermon outline. He is against bad investment. Namely, setting your heart on the comforts and securities that money can afford in this world. Money is to be invested for eternal yields in heaven. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Worship point. Worship the God of the universe, who is never ashamed to be called your God, when you live by obedient faith, looking forward to treasures in heaven that come to those who earnestly seek him. I remember my seminary professor, R.C. Sproul, talking about one time that he preached a practice message at his seminary. He went to Union Seminary, which is known as a fairly liberal seminary, even when he went there in the 60s. And the professor blistered him because he had the audacity to talk about the substitutionary atonement of Jesus on the cross, which is an absolute staple of the Christian faith. But apparently this professor thought that it was outdated and no longer relevant, and so R.C. got absolutely blistered for preaching this message. And he went to one of his other seminary professors that he respected and said, I'm absolutely devastated, and this guy just blistered me for this. And the seminary professor leaned back and said, oh, blessed are you, Roberto. Is Robert Sproul. Blessed are you. Well, I don't feel too blessed. I just got blistered in front of my whole class, and everybody in my classmates all were cringing at the rebuke that I had to endure. Oh, but blessed are you when men persecute you for righteousness' sake, for great will be your reward in heaven. Do you believe that, R.C.? Do you see how the attacks of this world can be worn as a badge of honor if you believe the words of Jesus? If you believe the words of Jesus? Gospel application. Heaven is so amazing, no one ever can do anything to earn it. But God takes so much pleasure in his children who live by faith in the work of his son Jesus that he is delighted to give heaven to them as a gift. Spiritual challenge. No matter what you may suffer or be asked to endure, be so heavenly minded that you are of unimaginable earthly good. When I was a kid, I remember several people talking about Christians that were do-nothings. We still have them today. We don't call them do-nothings. But they were saying they're so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly good. It was a word of indictment against them, that they were only thinking about Jesus and only thinking about heaven, that they never did anything here on earth. Folks, if you're really thinking about Jesus, and if you really love God, you will be of unimaginable earthly good. Because if you love God, you're going to love his world in which that he created. You're going to love his people that he created in his likeness and in his image. And you can't love his world and you can't love his people by being apathetic and just dismissing yourself and not living in this world anymore. So if somebody says of a Christian they're so heavenly minded, they're no earthly good, they're not heavenly minded. Their head's somewhere else. I would like to tell you where it was, but I won't tell you that. C.S. Lewis, in your sermon outline, hope is one of the theological virtues. This means that a continual looking forward to the eternal world is not, as some modern people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that to leave this present world as it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. The apostles themselves, who set on foot the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world that they become so effective in this. He's right. He's right. And folks, there are moments in my life, as I mentioned when I first began the sermon, when I'm connected with Jesus and I'm connected with him. It's one of those serendipitous moments where I'm ready to do anything Jesus asked me to do. But unfortunately, I'm not sure any of us lives there 24/7, 365. But you need to take those moments that you're connected with Jesus, and you need to hang on to those, and by faith, live as if you were in those moments the rest of your existence until they come again to reinforce you. That's part of what Abraham did. That's part of what Noah did. It's certainly what Moses did. In 2 weeks, we'll talk about him. Moses doubted big time whether or not it was actually doing what God wanted him to do. But he hung in there and stayed the course because he remembered those moments when he was connected with the God of the universe. The burning bush moments. And I believe God gives us all 15 minutes a year maybe, 15 minutes a decade maybe, where we have this unbelievable connection with the God of the universe. Do not forget in the dark what you knew to be true in the light. Hang on to it. By faith, realize that what God has promised you is true, and you need to live your life in light of that. No matter what people say, no matter what you may feel. So what? Chapter 11 is teaching us how to live by faith with love, power, influence, confidence, significance, meaning, and purpose without fear, worry, or shame. But we must declare chapter 11 on our agendas, our values, and trusting in ourselves. Keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. And there's a quote in your sermon outline from John MacArthur that says, the more we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the more easily it becomes for us to separate from the world. Folks, we got a whole world that is militating against our faith. In fact, it's been astounding in the course of my lifetime. I'm 64. Am I 64? I'm 64. But in the course of my lifetime, I've seen a huge shift in public opinion of Christians. When I was growing up, Christians were the bomb. Not in a bad sense. They're cool. People wanted to be Christians. People came to church in order to be identified with Christians. Those days are long gone. It's becoming increasingly evident that our culture is becoming increasingly hostile towards Christianity. And so it's going to be increasingly imperative that you keep your eyes fixed on Jesus, or they will dismantle your faith. Don't let them. Don't let them.